Question about your geographic location, Texas. He seems to think that your music seems to be at odds with what he expects from a band from Texas.
Well, that's true. On the face of it, Austin is probably best known in Texas, but Austin in particular, which is called the music capital of the United States, which is silly because it's not. But Austin in particular is known for blues and country, and has its roots in terms of musical notoriety in kind of Western swing stuff dating back to the 30s and 40s. And so it's never really been best known for its more cutting edge music forms.
Mm-hmm.
But since the 60s with the 13th floor elevators, and then in the as well as in the 70s, and particularly with the advent of the late 70s and the early 80s, and a movement that came out of a club called Raoul's, which was a punk club, Austin has had an alternative scene.
Mm-hmm.
There have not been many groups that have made it to national attention, but it's... Pardon me?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
There have not been many groups that have made it to national attention, but there's always been a fairly vital alternative music scene since I've been here.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that in terms of the emphasis of where the musicianship is in Austin, doesn't tend to be in my circle as much. It's been more of a reactionary strain of music because the indigenous music forms are more conservative. It's known for blues and Austin city limits and kind of cowboy music.
Mm-hmm.
Austin, however, is a very hip town. It's been a sort of hippie haven since the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
It's very liberal politically,
mm-hmm.
which really puts it at odds with the rest of Texas. So, in as much as the observation is, gee, this music doesn't seem to be very Texas-like in its orientation, the city of Austin is unlike anything else in Texas.
Mm-hmm.
In Texas.
I see.
So that's the best way I can answer it. There have been lots of great groups over the past 10 years in the scene of which I am a part, and a lot of those, I'm sure none of those you've heard of. They just haven't really made it.
Mm-hmm.
The one that made the highest national prominence is probably Poi Dog Pondering.
Poi Dog Pondering, right.
Poi Dog Pondering had a couple of albums out on Columbia.
Mm-hmm.
There was the group that I saw that inspired me to move to Austin was a group called Zeitgeist, who later became the Reavers, led by a fellow by the name of John Crosland, who just produced a new demo by us. And so there are a lot of music fans for what we do here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Is Timbuk 3 from Austin?
Timbuk 3 is from Austin. They actually moved here from somewhere else and sort of connected with the Austin scene. I think they came from Madison.
Mm-hmm.
And immediately upon arrival, they kind of hit it big. So I don't think we tend to think of them as much as part of our world, but they certainly are quite good.
Mm-hmm.
And I haven't heard anything they've done recently.
Mm-hmm.
But I think around the time I first graduated from college and moved here, their first record came out, and it was quite a smash.
Yeah. We hear that you used to do music that was a bit more experimental.
That's right. I started off in the deep end and swam to the shallows. Yeah, when I first got involved with music, I hooked up with a cellist who was mostly into Fred Frith and Bela Bartok and Eric Satie, and he successfully confused me for 2 or 3 years, and then we parted ways. I didn't really write songs as much as just sort of these experimental little numbers, and we were really just kind of goofing around. The first song I wrote and brought into the group seemed to sort of terrify the group, and it was really a song. It had a couple of choruses and verses and hooks, and that's when I kind of discovered that that's what I did the best, and the group really took shape as a result of that. We happened to be calling the group at that time Cotton Mather, but it wasn't the same group at all, and that group broke up, and I started a new group and just used the same name because we couldn't really think of another one.
So when did you arrive at the style that you currently...
Well, I put together this band in 1992, in the winter of 92, November, I guess, 92, and we made a single in 2 months later, and the single was Payday and Misinformation, was the B-side. And that's really sort of when the group got its voice and took shape, and I started writing a lot of material that just suited that group. I'd had after parting ways with the cellist, I'd taken about a year off and decided that I really didn't want to make music that had as its primary aim to prove to people that I could have gone to graduate school if I'd wanted to. I thought that was not necessarily the right idea, or that hurt people, just something real. The stuff we did was very atonal and jarring and nervous and kind of coffee-driven.
Coffee-driven. The interviewer, Mr. Tanaka, he was likening your style to the Kinks, Ray Davies. Is that a direct influence of yours?
Ray Davies is. That's right. I grew up listening to a lot of those British invasion groups. And where I grew up in Alabama, Casey Kasem was considered alternative, cutting edge. I grew up in a very small town in Alabama, and I loathed top 40 music, or what was offered, to me there, and really took refuge in my older brother's record collection. And he had all of that stuff, and the band, and Bob Dylan, the Kinks, even like bands like Jethro Tull and Yes, and of course the Rolling Stones and the Beatles. And I dived headlong into that. My favorite stuff was Eddie Cochran and Chuck Berry. And that's sort of how I survived my childhood of the 70s, was listening to that music. So it is a direct influence, I suppose.
And he also likens your sound maybe to bands like the Squeeze or Elvis Costello.
Elvis Costello and Squeeze, I got to know in high school, and I really like them a lot. I recently saw Costello in the Attractions when I was in Dublin, and that was a phenomenal show. It's the first time I'd ever seen them. People liken us a great deal to Squeeze, and I wouldn't say they're as direct an influence. I tend to think that my voice is reminiscent of the lead singer's voice, and we probably have a lot of the same influences. But I certainly think their early records are terrific. Can you hold on one second? I have to get rid of this.
Yeah.
They were someone trying to sell me something, I think.
Bad.
They claim to be a research center.
Of course.
Right. Well,
what else?
Kind of research are you doing? You're researching the best way to sell a condominium.
Researching your pocketbook.
Exactly. So that the 60s British invasion music was a big influence over me growing up, because there was just nothing else to listen to. And I didn't actually discover a lot of the punk music until after I was gone from Alabama and I was in college, and it had happened years and years before.
I see.
But just because I had led such a sheltered life.
Right. But I mean, that was the same for the original British invasion stuff as well. I mean, you didn't discover that until years later also.
That's right. So, I'm pretty far behind the curve.
And how about, like, you talked about liking Eddie Cochran and Chuck Berry, I believe, as well as the band. How about stuff by people your own age or contemporaries? Like, were you interested in hardcore stuff at the time?
I was interested in. I wasn't as interested in hardcore stuff. I mean, my favorite hardcore stuff is stuff that probably isn't called hardcore now, which is like Stiff Little Fingers and Sex Pistols. One of my favorite bands of all time is the Buzzcocks, and they. Of course, I became interested in them after they were long gone.
Of course.
But now they're back together, so I think I might be onto something,
Right. Well, I think the Green Day is compared a lot to the Buzzcocks.
Right. I'm not as big a fan of Green Day. I think they're good, but I'm not as big a fan. They're groups here in Austin who I think are better than Green Day and have better songs.
It's funny because everybody says that. They say Green Day's okay, but I have a punk band that's better than that.
Well, then that probably should be a pretty good indication that we're all full of shit, because then Green Day must be really great if everybody says that. I mean, I do hear that a lot.
Right.
Well, so-and-so is way better than Green Day ever was. Well, those guys must have something on the ball because, they've kind of blown the whole thing wide open, and I don't think you can just attribute that to a record company declaring them the messiahs of this new movement. They did it, and they've been around for 5-6 years before that record hit. So there's something that they're doing that people need to hear.
The question here that next is about, like, how do you place yourself within the scheme of things overall? How do you place yourself within the lineage of this sort of rock and roll history?
Well, I don't really think that much about, where we do or don't belong. I think that we're fairly unique unto ourselves in terms of what we're doing and the time that we're doing it. I think that there's certainly, in the live band, there's certainly a contemporary aggressiveness and edge that you don't get as much on the record because of the production, and nothing against the record. But I think it's a little bit clearer when you see the band live. There's a great deal of energy and a great deal of aggression, and we play our guitars very loudly, and so it doesn't seem so much a stretch. But there are ways in which the group is a bit of an anomaly unto the time where playing in it is a bit different. I certainly don't spend a lot of time saying, well, gee, where do we fit, and how can we make this sound a little more like what's coming out of Seattle? I'm just noticing that people are into it, so that's a hard question for me to answer.
Okay, that's fine. You don't have to feel compelled to answer everything. You just
that's my best shot.
Yeah, right. That's fine.
I'm not sure. Well, maybe you'll be able to tell me that in a few years.
Yeah, exactly. And you guys sort of dress up in mod suits, is it? We
dress up in kind of mod suits. That's right.
Now, what exactly is that all about? Is that just?
Well, when we first started doing that, I think we first started doing that because we found that our live show, we didn't quite know what to do with ourselves on stage. We almost got up and apologized a little bit for all the consideration we'd given the music in advance, and in terms of how we connected with the rest of what was going on in Austin. It seemed like we'd worried over it a little bit. So we needed to kind of up the ante in terms of our visual impact. And I was thinking Four Tops all the way.
Four Tops?
I was thinking that we needed to dress up like the Four Tops, like an old Motown act.
Right.
And, of course, we had overlooked the fact that we weren't tall and sleek and black, and that we were short and stubby and white. So immediately people started saying that we looked like the Kinks, which didn't really bother me that much, or the Zombies.
Right.
But it was really back before we got to where we could play our instruments very well. It gave us 2 or 3 songs of a sort of a buffer to figure out what the hell we were doing. For the audience would notice whether or not we were any good. You see, they would see us walk out in suits and be very excited and be quite sure they were getting a great rock show before they even began to scrutinize the music. So I think it kind of gave us a little bit of an edge, and then it just became part of our thing.
I see. It's not necessarily like an homage to the Beatles or anything. Or...
Oh, no, it's really not an homage to anyone. It's one less thing to worry about when you're thinking about what to put on before you go on stage. You know, well, I'm going to put on a suit.
A uniform. Just a uniform.
It's a uniform, that's right.
Also, the guy was wondering if it was your way of sort of bucking the Austin system, but in light of what you were saying about Austin, I guess that doesn't apply.
Well, it does, though. I mean, he's actually fairly astute. It is a bit of bucking the Austin system because we're certainly the only group in town that does that, and it got a great deal of attention. And it was a bit of a reaction to all the flannel. It certainly wasn't a hostile reaction. It was just sort of like, well, we'd kind of like to do something different. Gee, who's worn suits in alternative music in a long time? So we wanted to do something that people might go home remembering. And sure enough, people come up to me all the time and say, you know, well, you're that guy that's always wearing the suit. I'm not sure that's the thing you want people to remember.
Here's a question or two about you as a songwriter. It's about what you're trying to accomplish in writing songs. Is it more than just a musical voice for you? Is it a way of like connecting with the outside world, as it were? Is it your way of connecting with the rest of the world?
Well, I think to a certain extent it is. Let me think about that a second. I think that you hope that in expressing something intimate unto something meaningful unto yourself, that if it has appeal to other people, that that's a good thing. And I think a question you always have when you write a song is, well, is this only going to be important to me, or will anyone else be into this? And I just happened to find early on that excerpts from my diary, if you will, were kind of interesting to other people. It's certainly not a conscious process. I don't sit down and think about, well, what can I write that is going to sell records or people might like. On the contrary, I write something and say, well, surely they're not going to be into this, and then we just try it out. But it's certainly an attempt to reach people. A lot of writing songs is a highly personal process and very, very, very vulnerable. As far as an agenda, personal or political or spiritual or anything else, I can't say as I am very aware of one, other than to find a way to make the next record.
This is kind of a question from left field, because I think it assumes a couple of things that may not be true, but I'll hit you with it anyway. The interviewer, Mr. Tanaka, notes that punk music, for example, tried to change things by using a sort of cynicism and directing that cynicism at its listeners. In your case, is there kind of an irony in what you're singing about?
Well, there's a lot of subtlety and there's a lot of irony, and there's kind of a literate understatement. How much of that is actually going to have an impact on first listen? Probably none. But as people dig into the record, I believe that the effect of that is they can perhaps begin to discover a richness that they might not have expected to find there. Most of my favorite records like Armed Forces by Elvis Costello, for instance, as you kind of peel back each layer, you tend to find more. In my case, the irony and the double entendres and those kind of things are part of what I offer, I think, a listener as they explore. The way the Pistols offered anger, I think that the biggest and boldest emotions, perhaps the problem with that is you kind of only have one place to go with it, and it can be a great place. I think there's a real subtle array of ideas and emotions in our music, and it's a lot of them are what he's getting at with that question is a lot of what we offer is fairly muted. It's fairly understated, and it's certainly not calculated. That's probably just the way that I say things, and it might make it a little bit less likely to reach people than the latest cutoff of Dookie. It's not quite as apparent on first glance. I sometimes think that a Cotton Mather song, it's like a very interesting guy that showed up at a very dressy event wearing a trench coat, standing in the corner, just waiting for someone interesting to come up and ask him something. And sometimes it takes a while, but eventually they're going to get around to that guy.
So it's a multifaceted thing.
Well, I guess so. I hope so. It's a multifaceted thing. But the problem with a multifaceted thing is that it requires someone to start the conversation, and that's the risk you take by being subtle. And particularly in American music, you take a great deal of risk with being subtle because subtlety is not exactly a high premium on it in American pop culture. The chance of being overlooked is pretty great.
He cites Lost My Motto as maybe a good example of what you're trying to get across. He seems to think that you're sort of trying to get across the idea of new values, new kinds of values through your music.
I'm not so much trying. I think he's pretty perceptive. This is an aside. This is off the record. This is you've totally taken me by surprise. I've never had anyone that I've talked to ask as incisive questions or as accurate questions that I've talked to in the American press. I've never had anyone say anything like that to me. I just don't think that if you talk about, in poetry classes where they'll talk about close reading, the American press just doesn't do it the way foreign press does, and I've always heard this, and I'm intrigued by that. Anyway, that was an aside. That was back to Lost My Motto. Sure. I really think that when I wrote my notes to Kami about the translations...
notes to what?
Kami of Adoya.
Oh, okay.
I wrote him a set of footnotes because he called to my attention the fact that there were so many things in the lyrics that were difficult for him to understand.
Right.
Him being, he being a fellow who considers himself above average in his ability to perceive American vernacular.
Right.
And he kind of presented me with this problem and said, this stuff is kind of difficult for a Japanese audience perhaps to grasp.
Right.
And as I looked at the songs, the one that seemed to be the most subtle and the most difficult and full of the most specific kind of cultural allusions was Lost My Motto. And that was a great process for me. He really challenged me to go back and look at these songs that I had written a year before. And the thing that I realized about Lost My Motto is that it certainly has the most packed into it in terms of kind of an agenda of artistic concerns. It's not so much talking about new values as it is saying we've got some problems. we've got some problems with the old values, and I'm not sure what to do about it. The voice of the protagonist in the song is just saying the old system of values that I have doesn't work, and now I'm just going to, enjoy myself, I guess. There's sort of a hedonistic angle as well as kind of some sadness and longing in there. I really identify that song a lot with the work of American author named Walker Percy, who I've read a lot of. I guess I've read everything by, and the reason that song is first on the record, and the reason it's kind of lyrically the most important song, is it kind of sets the agenda for a voice that occurs throughout the record of a disconnected kind of protagonist who's kind of at odds with old values but not sure where the hell to go. And that same, you could say the same guy appears in the song Ivanhoe, maybe is Ivanhoe, in The World's Boutique, in a song called Saving Myself, in The New King of Trash. It's an album that kind of revolves, I mentioned Armed Forces before.
Right.
One of the things that really moved me about Armed Forces is that it didn't seem to be a collection of songs about Elvis Costello. It seemed to be a collection of songs about kind of a protagonist he'd invented. And that's what I specifically was doing with this record, is inventing a character who was going to have 12 problems, if you will. And those are the 12 songs on the record. And so a lot of the same themes recur throughout the album.
I see. So it's, I guess, what we would call a concept album.
I'm not so sure it's what we would call a concept album, because that's a little scary. I didn't think of it that way, but as we chose those songs, there seemed to be some unifying threads.
There's actually other songs mentioned later in the interview, so I'll skip to that part right now just so we can kind of continue with this thread here. You mentioned Ivanhoe. Did you ever feel like the character in Ivanhoe is the question here?
Well, I think absolutely, and that's a song that was very specifically self-referential, in that how can I say this? He's this quixotic character in the song who's at a place with the world and acting inappropriately chivalrous through the song is what the song's about. That, and there's certainly a parallel in that we're a band playing these songs that sort of harken back to days gone by, yet turning off our guitars really loudly and trying to break into MTV, not unlike Don Quixote tilting at the windmills. I mean, there's something certainly self-referential about it, and funny. It's we're joking about ourselves there as much as anything.
How about let's see? He mentions a couple other songs here. Across the Rubicon, you talk about crossing a river. What exactly is that supposed to be symbolic of?
Well, Cross the Rubicon is probably the one song on the record where it's a little more of an upbeat, sort of optimistic song. I don't know if he knows what the Rubicon is, but it's the river in Italy that Caesar crossed when he Caesar crossed the Rubicon, and once he had done this, it was the beginning of the end, or was it the beginning of the beginning? I'm not quite sure. I'm actually looking up in the dictionary, but there's an expression which means to cross the Rubicon once you've gone beyond the point of no return. Is the expression, and so it says in the dictionary, a limit when passed or exceeded permits no return. Caesar crossed it with his army in 49 BC to begin a civil war, and so it's simply a metaphor for taking a chance, I suppose,
Mm-hmm.
and doing what one has to do
Okay,
to get on with their life.
Right. So just it's just used as one metaphor then. The song "Mr. Should." This gets back to the theme of shared values breaking down.
Yes, I suppose "Mr. Should" and "Cross the Rubicon" are probably the two songs in which the sort of voice of the record kind of turns on itself a bit, and the lonely guy becomes the direct object as opposed to the speaker. But it's I'm not so sure what to say about that one. I wrote that about a friend who was just making a mess of their life, as if I wasn't at the time.
Uh-huh. But it was about maybe people in flux or people whose values are breaking down.
Well, people in flux who can't seem to decide between following their own dreams or the world of work.
Mm-hmm.
It's about a guy who's highly self-destructive.
Mm-hmm. Let me see. I'm just trying to. There's a couple more questions here about how this. We were talking about lost my motto a moment ago.
Well, I'll give you some information there that he might not have picked up on.
Mm-hmm.
Does he mention the song "Saving Myself" at all?
No.
That's one that Kami brought to my attention as a particularly difficult song to receive, and that's a song that works on a three-way pun that Mr. Tanaka might not be aware of. So I think that's a real critical song to the record.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if there is such a thing, but it ties in with "Lost My Motto." The song is called "Saving Myself,"
mm-hmm.
and it plays on the notion of let's see, what am I trying to say here? Well, the first obvious meaning of that is to rescue oneself,
mm-hmm.
and then the next meaning would be to save oneself. Save myself. The song's about this is kind of running parallel in the song about sort of religious concerns,
mm-hmm.
needing a savior. So I don't need to be saved. The first verse is something like, by you.
Pardon me?
I'm sorry, I'm trying to remember it.
Mm-hmm.
If you're heaven, who needs heaven's bridegroom? I might be a man that has a lot to lose, or you could say renewed, but that doesn't make your little tract true. And it's referring to, the Baptist,
mm-hmm.
I've been saved trip,
mm-hmm.
Which he wouldn't necessarily know about.
Right.
And then, of course, saving myself because I don't trust anyone else. Saving myself for a girl who knows the difference between money and wealth. There's the angle of virginity,
mm-hmm.
and so in that song, late in the record, looking for a savior, looking for a girlfriend,
mm-hmm.
and looking for a way out all kind of get combined
mm-hmm.
in one guy's big hairy dilemma, and his solution, if there is such a thing, is to save himself. And I'm not sure really where that takes us, but it certainly states a lot of problems all under one umbrella.
But is salvation one of the major themes?
Well, yeah, some attempt at salvation is certainly something that is in Lost My Motto and Saving Myself.
Mm-hmm.
And in World's Boutique, the salvation is the girl.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a little lost. At least I've got her bright, shining objects cosmology is the line. And the guy just decides that being surrounded by all this wonderful worldly stuff is going to be good enough, mm-hmm. at least tonight.
Mm-hmm.
I'm very uncomfortable talking about my words, and there's nothing that drives me crazier than someone quoting someone else's lyrics, but quoting your own is just heinous. in my opinion. So I'm just trying to do what I can to facilitate his understanding of this stuff, because so much of it, I mean, saving myself, you know, Mr. Tanaka is not going to probably be familiar with the Baptist tradition of saying I've been saved, and that's very culturally specific.
Yeah, that's right.
I had to write I wrote a whole, half-page letter to Kami trying to explain that.
You yourself, I guess, have sort of a theological background, right?
I do actually.
And so I guess that has a lot to do with what you choose to write about.
Yes, just because, you know, just like you, I tend to write about what I know about, and I don't venture off talking about the rainforest or something I have not a clue about, or good red wine. You know, I happen to have studied a lot of religious traditions in college, and grown up in a pretty devout Christian home, and I know a lot about this stuff. So I've been surrounded by it since I can remember. So it's something I can refer to, and I can also speak from a fairly experienced position of understanding the problems of growing up in the States and not having a belief system that feels like it's working very well.
What system?
Not really having a belief system that feels like it's working very well in contemporary culture. I'm part of the generation that really broke from the church, and there's really no repercussions for that. 20 years ago, not being a part of the church community is something that you would have been made to feel ashamed about. And that's just not true now. And we have a real breakdown in terms of the workability of our mythology here now, and what's going to replace that, I certainly don't know. But I think that the more typical angle of rock and roll is to lash out at Christendom and to, put Christ up on the cross and stick pins in him in the videos and do all this kind of profane stuff to show that you're cool.
Right.
It's very knee-jerk, and maybe it was daring in 1979, but it's done. It's really done. And I think it's a much more challenging position to try to stand in the midst of the problem and say, well, let's figure this thing out. Religion is there because people need something to link them back to meaning. And if our religion is not working, what does that tell us?
Yeah.
And what do we need to substitute? And I think rock and roll doesn't tend to take anything but a very kind of knee-jerk position towards that stuff.
So in a way, I guess you're providing an alternative, a more sort of rational, ethical alternative.
I'm actually not trying to provide anything except put myself in a situation that feels real, which is that the internal chaos and confusion that someone might feel about these issues, I'd simply try to portray in the songs, as opposed to taking any position at all. I'm not sure why a position needs to be taken.
Well, I guess what you could be saying, though, is that your music provides people with maybe a perspective, or maybe something solid to latch on to in a world of changing values.
I think so. I think sometimes people just need to know that that one option is not to not to say that things are falling apart because Christianity is horrible. Things are falling apart because things are changing. And some of the longing, some of the sadness, some of the bemusement expressed in those songs is, I think, just something that's part of the condition. and it's nice. Perhaps it's nice to just talk about that.
And you left, let's see, you had been going to Alabama University?
Actually, I went to the University of Virginia. I grew up in Alabama.
Oh, I see.
I went to the University of Virginia.
And you were doing a master's in theology?
I was going to. I finished my undergraduate, and I was starting a master's, and I decided that I really wanted to do something else. I didn't really have a sense of what my journey was, and so I moved out to Austin just a little impulsively, and I taught school for about 2 or 3 years, I guess, and came into contact with a lot of artistic people and musicians in particular. The school I worked in had a highly musical emphasis, which really was kind of on classical composers. There was an emphasis on classical composers because the man who ran the school was a classical musician, the first chair violinist of the Austin Symphony, and he died, and I took over some of his role at the school, and so I, in a sense, kind of became educated about music. I didn't grow up in a home where anyone played any instrument, and I just started playing and writing songs. This was a few years ago. Met the cellist around the same time. It all kind of happened simultaneously.
Oh, I see.
And I guess about at that point, teaching as I was teaching the children Bela Bartok, the cellist showed up, and off I was running. You know, if he'd showed up while I was teaching them Beethoven, it might have really been a different story.
Now, it said here that it says here that you were sort of revitalized by rock and roll. Had you become disillusioned with Christianity? Is that why you left your studies in theology?
I don't ever remember becoming disillusioned, but I remember thinking that that's not. I remember thinking that it would be hypocritical to pursue either studies in religious studies or the ministry. I remember thinking it would be hypocritical to pursue that wholeheartedly when I felt drawn to something else, and what that other something was, I didn't know. I just knew that it wasn't right for me, and I didn't specifically say, well, you know, I would become a minister in a church if only I believed in the resurrection. It never came down to anything as glamorous as some sort of fissure over doctrine. I just knew that it wasn't for me. I knew that I was much more of an observer and someone whose spiritual path was a lot more private than that, and that I had some other thing to do that I thought was in the arts. I had always done acting and some painting, and I hadn't quite found music yet.
You didn't have this concept in mind when you left school, then?
No, I had no concept in mind. I didn't really have a concept about this album until our conversation. That's not quite true, but I think many concept albums are discovered during interviews.
I see. And he was wondering if the World Boutique. Actually, you asked me if that was mentioned. I guess it is mentioned here. He was wondering if the World Boutique refers to when you discovered rock and roll.
I think so, in a way. I have never thought about it in that way, but I think it just has to do with discovering that it's, let's see, how can I say this? I think it has to do with discovering that the old world, whatever that might be to me personally, certainly, and the guy in the song, that is not necessarily part of the future. There's a line in the song. The song is told from the point of view of someone who's Jewish, which I'm not. my parents named me Abraham is one of the lines in the song is my parents named me Abraham, and I collapsed from the weight of it. The song's about someone whose old world of values is just too crushing, and they find something that works better, and they don't understand why, but they know it feels good. And I think to a certain extent there was a chapter in my life that was a lot like that, in which I had to let go of a great deal of my past and just embrace something that didn't necessarily make sense to me. And rock and roll is like that. You don't sit around thinking about, well, what next note is correct. You don't think, well, we should really play the F here because that's right, and that's what Brahms would have done. You just do the thing that feels good. Right. And so there's a parallel in that respect.
And Mr. Tanaka asks, is rock and roll a religion without a God?
Well, it depends on whether or not you consider Sting a god.
Well, maybe Sting considers Sting a god.
Yeah, it just depends on. I think that Sting thinks it's a religion with a god, and he's it. And I think that there are plenty of gods like that. But for me, it's certainly godless, and it's not a religion. For me,
it's not a religion.
No, it wouldn't be. I would think of it as a religion. Think of it as one of my favorite things to do, and to it's an important part of my life. I don't think of water as a religion, but swimming is one of my favorite things.
New King of Trash, does that refer to the deification or lionization of musical artists?
It does, but it specifically is talking about the kind of, I think the place where that keys into some of the stuff that he's picking up on, which is the dissolution of old values. That song has a lot of references to the old king, who's Elvis. The song it's just sprinkled with allusions to Elvis. But if you're looking for someone who'll never get fat, I can do that. And in the song, I'm comparing myself, or the I in the song is comparing himself to Elvis Presley, and of course is calling the medium trash, which is not anything that Elvis would have called it, but it's a song about decay, about who our heroes are. All this record, if you're calling rock and roll the answer to anything, the punchline of the record is that, well, rock and roll is a sort of dissolving art form as well, perhaps. Or is it? And that's where that song has its impact. The peak moment in the record is, the voice is just playing with the piano, and then the band comes crashing in on the line, "We're no heavy fad, so there'll be no cash." It's funny and it's dark, and again, I think a lot of Walker Percy when I wrote that song. He has something which he says in one of his last interviews he gave before he died, where he said, "All of my books ask one question: why is 20th century man so sad?" And all of his books tell a story of a protagonist who's the grandson of a great man who is the son of an even greater man, and something has gotten watered down in the gene pool with each generation, and so the great-grandson of the great Civil War general is this kind of manic guy that's sitting on a ledge above a golf course thinking of ending it all. And I was sort of treating rock and roll with that perspective a little bit there, saying, this isn't as good as the real thing, but this is what we've got now, and I think I'm as good at it as anyone around.
When did Walker Percy die?
He died, I guess, 2 years ago.
2 years ago.
And it's Percy, P-E-R-C-Y. Have you ever read any of his stuff?
No, in fact, I've never even heard of the name before.
Well, I think he's probably going to be considered one of the most highly regarded authors of the late 20th century.
Mm-hmm.
He's starting to be given his due now. His first book was called The Moviegoer,
Mm-hmm.
came out in the early 60s,
Mm-hmm.
and his very last book was called The Thanatos Syndrome.
Mm-hmm.
The Last Gentleman, which was his second book, is truly a masterpiece. I think you would really enjoy checking him out.
Uh-huh.
In fact, recently I was reading some liner notes on a Sam Phillips record in which he mentions Walker Percy directly, and I thought, well, I guess I'm not the only one who was
Mm-hmm.
intrigued by this guy.
Uh-huh. Skipping from Walker Percy to Michael Stipe of R.E.M.
Oh, yeah.
There's a quote of his mentioned here. It says he says, "I have no answers. I only have questions." Is that a sentiment you share?
I think definitely. I mean, I think that the only answers I have is like, well, this would be a good chord to end on.
Mm-hmm.
The answers I have are kind of what to do with music and what to do with the lyrics. But I think the most important thing that most artists do is to ask questions.
Mm-hmm.
And when you start trying to answer them, then you get into demagoguery.
Mm-hmm. I see. Let me just, I've got like 2 questions to go. Let me just flip my tape over here, okay?
Okay. Eddie Cochran and Chuck Berry.
Mm-hmm.
And that's sort of how I survived my childhood of the 70s, was listening to that music.
Mm-hmm.
So it is a direct influence, I suppose.
And he also likens your sound maybe to bands like the Squeeze or Elvis Costello.
Elvis Costello and Squeeze, I got to know in high school, and I really like them a lot. I recently saw Costello in the Attractions when I was in Dublin, and that was a phenomenal show. It's the first time I'd ever seen them.
Mm-hmm.
People liken us a great deal to Squeeze, and I wouldn't say they're as direct an influence. I tend to think that my voice is reminiscent of the lead singer's voice, and we probably have a lot of the same influences. But I certainly think their early records are terrific. Can you hold on 1 second?
Mm-hmm.
I have to get rid of this.
Yeah.
They were someone trying to sell me something, I think.
Bad.
They claim to be a research center.
Of course.
Right. Well,
what
kind
else?
of research are you doing? You're researching the best way to sell a condominium.
Researching your pocketbook.
Exactly. So that the 60s British invasion music was a big influence over me growing up, because there was just nothing else to listen to.
Uh-huh.
And I didn't actually discover a lot of the punk music until after I was gone from Alabama, and I was in college, and it had happened years and years before.
I see.
But just because I had led such a sheltered life.
Right. But I mean, that was the same for the original British invasion stuff as well. I mean, you didn't discover that until years later also.
That's right. So, I'm pretty far behind the curve of music, because the indigenous music forms are more conservative. It's known for blues and Austin City Limits and, kind of cowboy music.
Mm-hmm.
Austin, however, is a very hip town. It's been a sort of hippie haven since the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
It's very liberal politically,
mm-hmm.
which really puts it at odds with the rest of Texas. So, in as much as the observation is, gee, this music doesn't seem to be very Texas-like, in its orientation, the city of Austin is unlike anything else in Texas. In Texas.
I see.
So that's the best way I can answer it. There have been lots of great groups over the past 10 years in the scene of which I am a part, and a lot of those, I'm sure none of those you've heard of. They just haven't really made it. The one that made it the highest national prominence is probably Poi Dog Pondering.
Poi Dog Pondering, right.
Poi Dog Pondering had a couple of albums out on Columbia. There was a group, the group that I saw that inspired me to move to Austin was a group called Zeitgeist, who later became the Reavers, led by a fellow by the name of John Crosland, who just produced a new demo by us. And so there are a lot of music fans for what we do here.
Yeah. Is Timbuk 3 from Austin?
Timbuk 3 is from Austin. They actually moved here from somewhere else and sort of connected with the Austin scene. I think they came from Madison. And immediately upon arrival, they kind of hit it big. So I don't think we tend to think of them as much as part of our world, but they certainly are.
Question about your geographic location, Texas. He seems to think that your music seems to be at odds with what he expects from a band from Texas.
Well, that's true. On the face of it, Austin is probably best known in Texas, but Austin in particular, which is called the music capital of the United States, which is silly because it's not. But Austin in particular is known for blues and country, and has its roots in terms of musical notoriety in kind of Western swing stuff dating back to the 30s and 40s. And so it's never really been best known for its more cutting edge music forms. But since the 60s with the 13th floor elevators, and then in the as well as in the 70s, and particularly with the advent of the late 70s and the early 80s, and a movement that came out of a club called Raoul's, which was a punk club, Austin has had an alternative scene. There have not been many groups that have made it to national attention, but it's, pardon me?
Yeah.
There have not been many groups that have made it to national attention, but there's always been a fairly vital alternative music scene since I've been here. I would say that in terms of the emphasis of where the musicianship is in Austin, doesn't tend to be in my circle as much. It's been more of a reactionary strain. And the single was Payday and Misinformation, was the B-side. And that's really sort of when the group got its voice and took shape, and I started writing a lot of material that just suited that group. After parting ways with the cellist, I'd taken about a year off and decided that I really didn't want to make music that had as its primary aim to prove to people that I could have gone to graduate school if I'd wanted to. I thought that was not necessarily the right idea, or that hurt people, just something real. The stuff we did was very atonal and jarring and nervous and kind of coffee-driven.
Coffee-driven. The interviewer, Mr. Tanaka, he was likening your style to the Kinks, Ray Davies. Is that a direct influence of yours?
Ray Davies is. That's right. I grew up listening to a lot of those British invasion groups. And where I grew up in Alabama, Casey Kasem was considered alternative, cutting edge. I grew up in a very small town in Alabama, and I loathed top 40 music, or what was offered, to me there, and really took refuge in my older brother's record collection. And he had all of that stuff, and the band, and Bob Dylan, the Kinks, even like bands like Jethro Tull and Yes, and of course the Rolling Stones and the Beatles. And I dived headlong into that. My favorite stuff are quite good, and I haven't heard anything they've done recently. But I think around the time I first graduated from college and moved here, their first record came out, and it was quite a smash.
Yeah. We hear that you used to do music that was a bit more experimental.
That's right. I started off in the deep end and swam to the shallows. Yeah, when I first got involved with music, I hooked up with a cellist who was mostly into Fred Frith and Bela Bartok and Eric Satie, and he successfully confused me for 2 or 3 years, and then we parted ways. I didn't really write songs as much as just sort of these experimental little numbers, and we were really just kind of goofing around. The first song I wrote and brought into the group seemed to sort of terrify the group, and it was really a song. It had a couple of choruses and verses and hooks, and that's when I kind of discovered that that's what I did the best, and the group really took shape as a result of that. We happened to be calling the group at that time Cotton Mather, but it wasn't the same group at all, and that group broke up, and I started a new group and just used the same name because we couldn't really think of another one.
So when did you arrive at the style that you currently...
Well, I put together this band in 1992, in the winter of 92, November, I guess, 92, and we made a single in 2 months later.